Morning and welcome to the Ending Racism Partnership. This is Reverend Mark Kelly Tyler, pastor of Mother Bethel AME Church, and I'll be back in a few moments along with other panelists to have a very important conversation that we're happy that all of you have decided to spend your time this morning talking with us about. Today, about midnight actually, Hulu started streaming The United States versus Billie Holiday. It's a new biopic directed by Philadelphia's own Lee Daniels. And it tells the story of the song Strange Fruit, originally a poem written by a young Jewish man who had witnessed the lynching in the South, put to music and made famous by Billie Holiday. Talked about strange fruit. That's what our people called those bodies that hung on southern trees in the late 1800s and throughout the 1900s. During the anti-lynching campaign, many people used Billie Holiday's song and sent it to members of the United States Congress as a way of helping to expose them to the horrors of lynching and to get them on the side of Black people. Sad to say that here we are all these years later, and there's still strange fruit, not necessarily on trees, but we are witnessing the same effect, whether it's Fruitvale Station in Oakland, California with Oscar Grant, Sanford, Florida with Trayvon Martin, Louisville, Kentucky with Breonna Taylor, or the story that brought so many of us together from Minneapolis last year with George Floyd, and to show that Philadelphia is not immune, even in West Philadelphia with Walter Wallace. We're here because we believe that racism is the original sin and the original wrong in this country that has never been dealt with. And how appropriate to start this conversation on ending racism in Philadelphia, the birthplace rather, of democracy. If we can't fix it here, it might not be able to be fixed anywhere. We have an obligation, and that's why we're here. One of our persons who've been working with us made a statement that was so powerful to me last week. He said, that which has been done can be undone. And while it may seem like a Herculean task to try to end racism, the fact that this is not how the world was created, but it's something that has been done, means that it can be undone. And we're here because we have a belief that even if not in our lifetime, that racism can, must, and will be undone. So we thank you again for being along the ride, and we expect that by the time we finish this webinar, that you will, like us, be so committed that you'll bring others into this conversation. To help us today is one of the persons who's helping to sponsor this conversation. He is the new president, CEO of Independence Health Group, a graduate of Florida A&M. He's a FAMU Rattler. Greg Deavens. Greg, good morning.
Morning, and thank you, Reverend Tyler. I didn't anticipate the reference to FAMU, so I appreciate that. Independence is proud to join Mother Bethel and the Urban Affairs Coalition as co-conveners of the Ending Racism Partnership, and it's my honor to welcome our audience to today's discussion, A Blueprint to End Racism. In 2020, Black lives continued to be lost, as Reverend Tyler noted, tragically and needlessly, including George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and Walter Wallace Jr. At the same time, communities of color were disproportionately impacted by the health and economic effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. This was a year that made clear the effects of systemic racism and inequity in America. We need a plan to build a more just society that makes it possible for everyone to achieve their own version of the American dream. Despite the challenges, I'm increasingly optimistic that we can make progress toward this noble goal. Developments last year provide some basis for optimism. First, 2020 revealed that we have more allies for fairness and equity than ever before in our nation's history. And second, there's more institutional support for the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion than ever before in our communities, our governments, and our businesses. There's a real momentum to eradicate systems that oppress people and limit opportunities based on race, and to advance a model that provides equal protection under the law and equal opportunity based on individual talent, potential, and work effort. Our goal for the Ending Racism Partnership is to turn that momentum into action here in Greater Philadelphia. Together, we can help answer the call for justice that was made so powerfully in our streets last year. This call for justice has been heard and discussed in many corporate suites, boardrooms, legislative capitals, and other venues. And on behalf of my colleagues at Independence, I want you to know that our company is committed to respond to the call. We join all of you in rejecting racism, fighting to eradicate inequities, and embracing true equal opportunity. We continue to champion a diverse and inclusive business community in Philadelphia, and we are redoubling our efforts to make our healthcare system more equitable and effective in terms of access and outcomes. Healthcare inequities are among the most damaging manifestations of racism for the Black and Brown communities. As you may have seen recently, the CDC reported that the difference in life expectancy between Blacks and whites grew from 4 years to 6 years in the year 2020 alone. Here in Philadelphia, we know that in certain zip codes with largely Black populations, life expectancy is nearly a decade shorter than the national average. That's why Independence, AmeriHealth Caritas, and Project Home are trying to impact the social determinants of health in some of those zip codes. And one of the reasons why Independence joined with the Philadelphia Tribune to launch Our Community, Our Health, a public awareness and nutritional screening campaign to alter the trajectory whereby African Americans in Philadelphia are more likely to be affected by chronic health conditions like diabetes, heart disease, and obesity. With the Ending Racism Partnership, we have a tremendous opportunity to eliminate the effects of racism in our community. It's not a simple task because we are fighting to modify perspectives and systems that have existed for decades. But it's necessary and it can be done if we're open, honest, and committed. It starts with listening to voices that tell us what the experience of communities of color is like today. That will allow us to develop shared priorities for a more equitable Philadelphia. And together, we can level the playing field and expand opportunity so that everyone gets a seat at the table. Those are the goals of the Partnership Steering Committee, co-chaired by Reverend Tyler, Sharmain Matlock-Turner, and Independence's own Steve Fera, our Executive Vice President of Public Affairs. I'm extremely grateful for their leadership. Right here in Philadelphia in 1967, only months before he lost his life, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. described the concept of building a blueprint for your life. This is good advice for individuals, and it's also good for institutions and for communities. A blueprint to end racism can guide our actions as we set out to make this region a beacon for diversity and equity. So I ask you, please engage, share your voice, and join the movement. If we establish principles of justice, communicate honestly, and create opportunity for all, we can and will eliminate the effects of systemic racism and inequities for future generations. Thank you for listening, and it's now my pleasure to turn things over to Pedro Ramos, a great philanthropic leader here in Philadelphia and a member of the steering committee. He will give us an overview of the Ending Racism Partnership. Pedro?
Thank you, Greg, and good morning, everyone. I'm Pedro Ramos, President and CEO of the Philadelphia Foundation and a proud member of the Ending Racism Partnership Steering Committee. The Ending Racism Partnership is a citywide participatory collaboration of Philadelphia residents, leaders, and influencers from community, business, government, and philanthropy, all of whom have come together with the common purpose to end racial injustice and economic inequality in our city. The Ending Racism Partnership is conceived of as a multi-phase, multi-year project. Initially, the partnership seeks to include the following steps. First, establishing shared priorities for healing and rebuilding, identify and take timely action for measurable impact, and eventually build a sustained collaborative effort for change. Today, we embark on the first phase of our collective work, holding space for listening and reflecting. As we do so, it's helpful to acknowledge the circumstances under which this partnership was conceived. The idea of the Ending Racism Partnership was born on May 26, 2020, the day after George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis. The Ending Racism Partnership exists to identify, grow, and provide leadership across sectors willing to call out and address the racial injustice and economic disparities that keep our region and its people and institutions from realizing the potential, promise, and prosperity for all that comes from actualizing real racial equality. The partnership seeks to inform its priorities and help shape solutions towards ending racism for the community by engaging Philadelphia citizens and community-based advisors in fields like health, education, criminal justice, housing, arts and culture, and employment. Over time, supported by a steering committee representing cross-sections of authority, influence, and voices in Philadelphia, the partnership will work towards a new vision and new agenda to dismantle racism and achieve racial equity. Now I'm proud to introduce the moderator of this morning's roundtable discussion, my friend Sharmain Matlock-Turner, President and CEO of the Urban Affairs Coalition and co-chair of the Ending Racism Partnership Steering Committee. Thank you, Sharmain.
Thank you, Pedro. And thank you, Reverend Tyler, and also Greg Deavens for such a powerful introduction to our work. And I really want to thank all of you who have joined us today. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to our roundtable discussion. Through the Ending Racism Partnership, we have already hosted 18 community stakeholder discussions, engaging 127 individuals in conversation we like to call Equity in Action Roundtables. Our intention is to engage citizens and community-based stakeholders because we believe it's their insight and their experience that will help define the challenge and refine the goals of our work. By holding space for listening and reflecting, we hope to shape the solutions to end racism. In addition to engaging community members and stakeholders, we've also had powerful discussions with our Ending Racism Partnership Steering Committee. And these Equity in Action discussions continue today in our first Blueprint to End Racism Roundtable series. Today, we're joined by diverse voices from our steering committee, and I'd like to introduce them to you. First, Reverend Mark Kelly Tyler, who is the pastor of Mother Bethel AME Church, of which you had the opportunity to hear his powerful opening remarks earlier. He is the co-chair of our Ending Racism Partnership Steering Committee, and I'm proud to say a member of the UAC board. Sue Jacobson is the new board chair of the Greater Philadelphia Chamber of Commerce for Greater Philadelphia and president of her own firm, Jacobson Strategic Communications. Kevin Harden Jr. Esquire is an attorney at RossFellerCasey and is a leader in our Friends of UAC organization, as well as a new member of the Urban Affairs Coalition Board. We also have Lee Huang, president and principal for Econsult Solutions, a firm that works on issues of economic opportunity and how it is affected in urban communities. Welcome all of you to our panel this morning. Merriam-Webster defines racism as a belief that race is a fundamental determinant of human traits and capabilities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. According to recent polls, for the first time it appears in some, a majority of Americans think that racism does exist, but they are divided about whether racism is systemic or just perpetrated by some bad apples. I'm going to ask Lee to talk a little bit about how he has witnessed systemic and institutional racism in our city and in our world. Lee?
Thanks, Sharmain. I've certainly been the experienced slurs and threats myself as an Asian person. I did want to take the opportunity to highlight the existence of anti-Asian violence that has seemed to have accelerated, particularly in light of COVID and all of that. My remarks this morning, though, I want to focus on the fact that I have 3 children. They're all adopted, 2 from Asia, and 1 who is Black from Oklahoma City. And my 2 Asian children, they know that there are conversations that that I need to have with their little brother that I won't need to have with them, about staying safe, about interactions with the police, and just generally about moving about the world. And to me, that is a demonstration of the systemic nature of racism. Far too many people believe that racism is a matter of we should be nice to one another, and we absolutely should. And unfortunately, there are people that can't even do that. But it's great that Urban Affairs Coalition is highlighting the institutional and systemic aspects of racism. The reason why I know that I need to have conversations with our youngest child that I don't with our other children is because I've spoken with people, friends of mine, who look like Asher, my youngest, who have had at least one and usually multiple instances in their life where they have been accosted, assailed, surveilled, or worse. Their pedigree did not shield them from this. Their manners did not shield them from this. Their ability to keep cool in those situations did not shield them from this. The only difference was the color of their skin. That is a systemic issue. And that is why I need to have different conversations with my children. And that is the proof for me that that sort of systematic racism exists in our society.
Thank you, Lee. Sue, same question. In what ways have you witnessed systemic or institutional racism?
Thanks, Sharmain. You know, it's, I would say one of my first memories was in 7th grade. And my best friend, Yvonne Goldsberry, and we were on the soccer field before practice. And Yvonne is African-American. And she was approached by someone we both knew. And she said to Yvonne that she had a funny joke to tell her. The problem was that the joke wasn't funny at all. It was racist. And Yvonne and I were both really upset. And I just have to say, it was wrong, it was mean, and it was hurtful.
Thank you, Sue. As we take a look at how do we end racism, I'm curious to hear from Reverend Tyler and then from Kevin Harden to talk a little bit about whether it's on an individual interpersonal level or on an institutional system level, what will it take to end racism in Philadelphia and in America? Reverend Tyler?
Yeah, thanks. I want to just, first of all, appreciate Susan's story. And you know, in this moment where we're focusing so much on institutionalized and systemic racism, we often forget the personal side of this. And so I don't think it's an either or, it's both and. But, you know, if you have to prioritize things, you know, for those of us who are on the receiving end of this, we definitely have to start with the systemic portion of this and dealing with institutions that are so entrenched in their behavior that sometimes they can't even see what they're doing. I mean, listen, it's one of those issues where everyone acknowledges it's a problem, but nobody's responsible, which I don't understand. So we all know it's a problem. It's all real. It's in our own business. It's in our institution. It's in our academic, you know, place. And yet I didn't create it. I didn't benefit from it. So I don't know what you want me to do about it. If we're going to fix it, you know, we're going to have to face it. That's a real famous sermon from an AME preacher, Reverend Dr. William Watley, that says, to fix it, you have to face it. And we cannot, under any circumstance, let this moment go by where we do not face this problem that we have before us. It is everywhere. When you talk about racism, it is in the way in which our school funding takes place. Power has been working on this for years now, trying to have equitable funding for public education in the state of Pennsylvania. One of our researchers who's a member of a Power congregation, David Mazinkas, pointed out to the legislature in Harrisburg that regardless of where Black students were situated in the state, we thought it was a Philadelphia problem, but wherever Black students were situated throughout the state, they were funded less than their white counterparts. That's not an accident. That's not something that just as a strange coincidence. That was done by design, whether intentional or unintentional. It was designed to operate that way. When you think about policing, it's the same exact thing. Whether or not I'm in Philadelphia or Ferguson, the types of experiences that Black people have with law enforcement are continually reinforced. And so we cannot simply just, wish this away, but we're going to have to take a hard look. And let me just say this one last thing, Sharmain, that, what we experienced last summer in this city, and I was on the streets of Center City when people began running in stores and looting. I was in West Philadelphia. I was tear gassed on 51st and Chestnut and experienced all of that. And I don't care how terrifying people think that moment was, that was the tip of the iceberg. And if we do not address seriously the inequity in this city, the poorest big city in the country, then we have much more of that coming. And I hope for all of our sakes that we find a way to fix it.
Thank you, Reverend Tyler. Kevin?
For me, specifically, I always speak about racism at a systemic level because I think that it's a system. It's the same way we have our constitutional system of government, the same way that we have our capitalistic system of commerce. The racist system is kind of baked into the cake. So if we don't look at it from a systemic perspective, we won't be able to truly address the things that are going on. But for me, and personally, my thought process is that ending racism really has two sides to it. The first is reducing future harm that's caused by racism. And the second is repairing past harms that were caused by racism. I'm going to address the second part first, and that's repairing past harms. See, as a lawyer studying constitutional law, you pretty much understand that there's never been a comprehensive study of the impact of racism in the United States on African-American people, or for in reality, many other minority organizations. So the first thing we're going to have to do is that we're going to have to analyze past actions. We're going to have to look at things like what did Levittown, the cities that were built. I mean, yesterday I was on a call where they talked about the inventor of the modern American suburb, William Levitt. He built Levittown, Pennsylvania, and he refused to sell homes to Black people. Has anyone ever sat down and done a full analysis of what the impact of those racist actions were and what sort of impact that has had on African-American people? I can tell you absolutely not. It has not happened. And after we study the actions, we then have to do an analysis and acknowledge that there were racist things that happened. So many people are afraid to acknowledge that racism has happened and that people are continuously impacted by it because they believe that it's their personal responsibility to fix it. And when people feel that something is their personal responsibility to fix, they think that they're being blamed for it. I'm not blaming anyone for racism. I'm blaming you for continuing to benefit from it and then acting as if it's not happening. So And then after you study those impacts and after you look at the things that have happened in the past to repair them, we're going to have to approach them in a creative and flexible way. And it's our responsibility as a society. We all have a social contract where we've all agreed that if someone walks up to me and punches me in my face, I'm not allowed to just chase them down and punch them. I have to report it to the police, and then we go to court, and then the court decides how best to prevent there from being harm in the future. The judge doesn't say, Mr. Harden, you can now punch the man that punched you in the face back. He says, no, we're going to get that man help. We're going to get him probation. We're going to get him anger management so that we reduce future harms in the future. And we need to have those sorts of creative and flexible ideas about moving forward. People have to understand that divestment of the benefits of racism is not punishment. Divestment from the benefits of racism is not punishment. Some people have had 3 or 4 times at the dinner table. You think about when you go out for dinner and you get your first meal, then you get seconds, and then you get a doggy bag, and then they ask you if you would like dessert. Well, there are certain members of the American family who have never had an opportunity to have a meal at the table. And asking you to let someone else eat before you get seconds, make a doggy bag and get dessert is not punishment. It's equity, it's fairness. And the same thing has to happen with existing systems. So we have to sit at existing systems and ask ourselves, are the owners of this organization owners because they're the most ingenuous people, or are they just the people that the United States has allowed to be the owners of things? And I mean that as loaded as possible. Certain people have been allowed to own certain things, including people, since the beginning of this country. And it just so happens that the owners of many of American businesses are the same people who have been owning things since the beginning of this country. So when you think about the idea of how you can end racism individually moving forward with the systems that you exist, I'm not asking anyone to boil the ocean. We don't have enough heat for that. But you should ask yourself all the time, when you sit down at the different tables that you sit at, ask yourself the same analogy that I just used about dinner. Ask yourself if the people around the corporate boardroom that you're sitting in, the people sitting at your church, the people sitting at any institution that you participate at, are they the same people that have already had dinner, that are now getting seconds, that are looking for dessert, and are taking home a doggy bag? Are they the same people over and over again? Because if the answer is yes, then it's more than likely that your institution is racist, because certain people have historically been banned from being allowed to have individuals that look like me participate. So when you sit down at dinner, ask yourself, when's the last time you had a Black person at your dinner table? When's the last time you had a Black person at your corporate boardroom? When's the last time you worshiped with a person of color? And then you start to ask yourself and interrogate, well, why is that? And then if it's the same Black person over and over again, ask yourself if that also is perpetuating racism, that you have 1 or 2 Black friends that come over for dinner, but you have a plethora of individuals who are of the majority that sit around for dinner. We have to change the distribution of equity and power in this country. We have to change what has been constitutionally deemed to be the ownership class, and that will be what ends racism.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I'm going to ask all of our panelists now to think about our Ending Racism partnership. What are the actions you are taking to help end racism, either as an individual or through your institution? And what can others in your network and your community do to join this movement? And I'm going to start with Reverend Tyler.
Thanks, Sharmain. And Kevin, thank you really for what you just offered. That's really helpful and powerful. So I mentioned earlier that I work with Power. That's used to be Philadelphians, but now it's Pennsylvanians organized to witness, empower, and rebuild. We are a faith-based organizing effort that is interfaith, interracial, inter almost everything. And we are expanding across the state in our work, primarily focused around racial justice in the following areas: education, climate, health, jobs and economic development, and also, most importantly for me, around policing. So I'm one of the co-directors for our Live Free team, and Live Free is all about ending mass incarceration, stemming gun violence and, again, holding police officers accountable. Now, you can't talk about, racism in this moment. I mean, we've been called here really because of the incidents of last year. And if we're not serious about changing how policing is done, and more than just changing how policing is done, it's about how policing is managed. I think for far too long, we've had certain assumptions that mayors and city council across the country, this is not just against Philadelphia, but across the country, can do this on their own. But, all of the evidence, in front of us says that is not true, that we need strong civilian-led oversight. Thankfully, in November, we were helpful in passing a bill that we've been calling for some time for an independent civilian oversight board. And while this is a start, I think where we ultimately need to go is to have a board that is directly elected by the people. This is being hammered out in city council now. So people want to know, what can you do? Pay attention to the way that this is being worked out. If this quote unquote civilian-led board is something that is just simply, again, a rubber stamp for the mayor's office or the city council, I don't know how independent it will be, because policing means so much to Black people in this city that at almost 55 years old, I still have to help officers through a traffic stop. Shows you just how much of an issue this is. We need independent. And by independent, that means that just like council is elected directly from the people, we need an independent oversight board directly elected from the people. That's what we're advocating for. That's what we're pushing for. And that's what we certainly hope that people will help us to do. We need a board that oversees the budget, oversees the hiring, oversees the discipline, and everything else to rein in policing, and also to stop officers from having to do things like mental health checks and checking on the unhoused, but to give that to other people where they can then focus their attention on areas where they are needed most in our community. So again, that's what we're working on, and we certainly would love people to come alongside of us. Powerinterfaith.org.
Sharmain, you're on mute.
Lee, what are you working on, either as an individual or in any of your organizations, to end racism in our city and in our world?
Thanks, Sharmain. You've really gathered a diverse group on the steering committee, including my fellow panelists. I've learned so much from their perspectives, and I really try to bring that into the different roles that I play in my professional life. I just stepped off the school board. Public education has been mentioned over and over again as both a way to combat systemic racism, but also, unfortunately, a source of disparity. And as the first locally appointed board in almost 2 decades, we really are trying to make sure that equity is infused throughout all discussions, decisions, resource allocations. It really is a difference maker from an economic and societal standpoint for all students to be able to have a quality education. And we have a lot of work in order to do that. But the board is certainly elevating that as a priority among all the priorities. In my day job as a professional service provider, and I know Kevin as a lawyer can appreciate this, it's important that while we represent a client, we represent a side, we're trying to get the client what they want to do in order to succeed, that in the equity and inclusion space, and really in all spaces, that we're contributing to, that we're not contributing to the sustaining of racist practices. We actually have an equity and inclusion practice area, and it's been interesting that in all of our other practice areas, the conversations keep coming back to equity and inclusion. So that tells me that in addition to work that's specific to equity and inclusion, it's an issue that transcends all of the things that we work on: economic development, real estate, transportation, higher ed. All of these conversations, we're talking about equity and inclusion, and not just talking about it intellectually, but really feeling and empathizing and trying to affect progress. Something that is that I'm mindful of as the president of a professional service provider on the issue of racism is that we don't want to be profiting from the problem. We want to be contributing to the solution. And I know that that sounds simple, but there's an entire cottage industry around equity and inclusion that I hate to say is profiting from the problem and is not doing enough internal thinking and enough hard work outward facing to contribute to the solution. So that's what we aspire to in my firm, and really glad to have this forum to learn and to contribute as well.
Thank you, Lee. Sue, what are you doing as an individual or as a leader? You have your own company, you're head of the Philly Chamber to end racism in our city and in our world.
Yeah, thanks, Sharmain. You know, I have to agree with Lee. I have learned so much too. And, you know, thank you to you and to Reverend Tyler and Steve Fera for the honor of being a part of the steering committee. It is crucial and important. You know, as chair of the board of the chamber, look, it's no secret that the triple crisis of COVID, massive business losses and unemployment, not to mention the past year's civil unrest, changed the landscape of Philadelphia in ways that we never imagined. And so what we did was we launched Recharge and Recover to deploy these short-term solutions. They're actionable solutions that would capitalize on the region's strengths and rebuild our economy and get people back to work. And Black and Brown communities have been the hardest hit through job losses, pandemic-related health disparities, and racial injustice. There is no doubt about that. And that is why the Chamber is focused on revigorating the economy through very targeted efforts to assist Black and Brown businesses and support workers. So I just wanted a couple of things we're doing. We're working on a reskilling initiative that Accenture Citizens in Pico and Philadelphia Works and others are all a part of. Over 85 businesses have signed on. We are going to reskill 5,000 people, and we're going to keep building that person by person, because that's what matters. It's business by business and person by person that we really need to focus on. We're just, I think it was the day before yesterday, we have all the major banks got together on Zoom in one room with CDFIs to talk about how can we help local Black and Brown and Asian businesses in need because of COVID. And there were 3 very actionable, these are all actionable, let's get stuff done. Let's not talk about it, let's do it. We do have a fantastic diversity, equity, and inclusion committee with over 1,000 committed chamber business members. And we are working daily, which also is really important, with the city and state on COVID-19 vaccine distribution, because again, the Black and Brown community has been disproportionately hit by all of this. So the bottom line, you know, Sharmain and everybody is I believe we have a responsibility to get involved in any way we can. And to always look around the table, as Kevin just said, I think that's so important. And encourage our friends and colleagues to do the same thing. And so at the Chamber, what I pledge to you and to our Chamber and our board and our members is that we're going to continually challenge ourselves and our membership to do more to fight systematic racism by initiating programs and making sure that our voices are heard.
Thank you, Sue. And Kevin, what are you doing to end racism in our city and in our community, both professionally and or personally?
Wear this hoodie a lot. That I think that has a big impact. Just joking a bit, but no, I have to. And rather than talk about what I do for a living, which a lot of people, you know, people can Google and figure out what type of work I do. But I think seriously, and I mean this, and I've explained this in our meetings before, that for a Black man like myself, existing is fighting racism. And I don't mean that in an arrogant way. I mean that in the most troubling way possible. COVID-19 impacted Black communities. That means that I went to more funerals this year than I've ever been to before in my life. That means that Reverend Tyler has had to challenge himself to get up and give more eulogies and be there for more families. His normal life, which is already challenging because of racism, has been exponentially made more difficult because of the crises that are affecting the African American community. What we've learned, we always say when white America gets a cold, we get the flu. Well, we saw this time that when white America got a cold, Black people got COVID, and we died again, an exponential rate compared to the rest of the community. So for my Black lawyer, community leader self to get up every morning and put my feet on the ground and speak to you all and meet with you and work until 2 o'clock in the morning and wake up at 6, that has been my testament to how much I want to end this crisis. There have been people that have been trying to solve racism since before I was born, and they were a lot smarter than I am. So for me to anticipate that any of the small incremental things I do, like filing lawsuits against some of the most powerful institutions in the city, are going to end racism, it would make me feel like I'm being a little bit too, I have too high an opinion of myself. But at the same time, I know that when I walk into a courtroom, when a police officer sees me, when I cuss out a bank lender because they disrespected me with the rate that they offered me, like the things that I encounter every day and that I'm able to challenge, I think that people have to understand that, again, Black people in this country are still giving unpaid labor to the benefit of this country. That's been historical. And when I talked about it in my last point that I made, that, you know, there's an ownership class in this country and there's an unpaid labor class in this country. And they seem to have remained the same despite abolition. And my job and how I view myself is that I am going to become a part of the ownership class. And that is in of itself a revolutionary act that America is designed to make sure doesn't happen. So when you see me doing what I do, filing the lawsuits that I file, starting the businesses that I start, just my existence, just my participation in the system and moving that needle in that way, that's how I'm fighting racism. And again, I'm wearing this hoodie.
Thank you, Kevin. We have about 15 minutes left, so I want to certainly thank all of you for sharing your views and your thoughts. And we want to ultimately make sure that we're continuing these courageous conversations. It is important to talk about this. Doesn't mean that we're all going to agree. Our perspectives are going to be different, but you heard everybody say how important it was to be a part of listening and hearing, as well as sharing as we continue to work on this effort. I'm going to ask Arun Prabhakaran, the Executive Vice President at the Urban Affairs Coalition, to help us with some questions over the next few minutes. And then we will end up with the final comments from our other co-chair, Steve Fera, as well as to talk about how we can make sure that all of you are engaged and involved in this work and what we are kicking off today that you can do to be a part of the Ending Racism Partnership.
Thank you, Sharmain, and all of our panelists. This has been an incredibly insightful group of people who are all deeply committed to solving the problems of institutional and systemic racism in our community and the society, and changing hearts and minds on an individual level. So I had the opportunity to review the questions, and I would like to open the questions. Sue, you are a public relations expert, and one of the questions that came up is, what role must the media play in ending systemic racism?
Well, I love that question because, and actually I have to do a shout out to the Inquirer, who, I don't know if everybody saw the recent op-ed that Sharmain and Steve Fera and Reverend Tyler wrote. And there was a really pretty fabulous quote in there. There are no hard and fast propositions to undoing deep-rooted racist systems and institutions in our country. And, you know, this obviously is something that we've got to work on. So to your point, Arun, I mean, we've got to do more of that. not just that op-ed, but we've got to stay in front of the media on this issue. And that means that we've got to bring those individual stories to the attention, and we have to keep pushing over and over again. So my answer is we need to stay with it. We need to be intentional about it. We need to be honest with reporters who are not reporting fairly, and that's how I would approach it.
That makes a lot of sense to me. And I think one of the implied pieces, and I open this up to any of the panelists, is the role of not so much the news media or the newspaper, because I think Sue is absolutely right about those sources. But what about the entertainment media, where many of the situations and circumstances that are presented are rife with stereotypes? Yet we've seen many different TV shows over the last 30 years really change views about people in different groups that have been marginalized in the past, like the LGBT community and others.
So I just want to jump in and just say, so yeah, while I'm appreciative that the Inquirer ran the op-ed, let's not forget that just a week and a half ago, the Inquirer had to report on themselves about just how much the entire operation is lacking in diversity. I mean, you have complete departments that don't have anybody Black in the Inquirer. And so if you're the paper of record, the main place that we go to for trusted information in Philadelphia, and you don't look like Philadelphia, then that's why you have, headlines that are so controversial. Buildings matter too would have never happened in a diverse newsroom. In a diverse newsroom, you would have never had the opinion page come out saying that, yes, the mayor made a mistake, the head of OEM made a mistake, and so did the police commissioner, but we think she should lose her job. She just happens to be the only Black person in the group, and everybody else gets to stay. I mean, it's things like this that, that represent the larger impact to your question, Arun, of what media looks like in this country, whether it's news or entertainment or sports, that even when you have Black faces up front, oftentimes behind the scenes, people who are making decisions, camera people, what goes in the web content and everything else tends to be persons who are not diverse. One last thing, the Inquirer ran a story last year talking about people who were deciding to leave or stay in Philadelphia. They profiled 3 families, 3 white families, as though Black families don't make the same kind of decisions about, do I stay in the city or do I raise my children in the suburbs? And so it painted the picture as something that is exclusively a white concern when it is not. This goes to the larger systemic issue, and that's where my real concern is.
Thank you. And I just want to highlight that your point is well taken, and other media outlets like WHYY are actively tracking who they ask questions to when they report. What is their ethnicity? What's their race? What's their gender? Where do they live in the city? And making sure that there's balanced reporting from sourcing to story writing to publishing and broadcast. So I thank you for that highlighted point. I think there is another question that really strikes me in the chat, which is, given how the elections went over the last year, there seems to be a great divide in the way that the public views the question of racism, and that racism has really come to the fore, not only people who want to see systemic injustice ended, but people who seem to be advocating for it in the choices that they're making, both personally, but also in the ballot box. So Sharmain, I know that you've had a lot of politics in your background. So tell me what you think on that.
Interesting point of view in reference to, all of these issues as it relates to race and how we're ultimately going to respond to it. There are a lot of concerns and a lot of issues that we see that just seem to just constantly be there. We have seen, yes, some, the polling has shown that there definitely are some changes that we're seeing. And we believe that it's also, we're seeing some real changes generationally, where we're seeing younger voters and younger people being more focused around this whole question. But again, our concern is that this not be a moment, that this has to be something that we are willing to dig into. And that's why we're trying to change hearts as well as minds as it relates to the long battle that it's going to take to ultimately end racism.
Thank you, Sharmain. So one of the other questions that came in, and I just want to note our time, we're getting close to the end. I have 2 questions left. One is a humorous one, Kev. People want that sweatshirt. Where'd you get it?
It's from Art Gallery. It's an African-American owned clothing line. It's, what is it called again? Yeah, I think it's called Department Gallery. That's what it's called. So yes, it's you can look them up online.
Hey, check it out, right? So, and then my last question, which I open to the group, is what can the public do, not only to end racism, but help the Ending Racism Partnership and the panelists in the effort to do this work? And I open that to the panelists.
I'll jump in.
Go ahead, Kevin.
You want to? So first and foremost, show up. There are, if you become civically engaged in the smallest way, and I know I'm probably preaching to the choir, because if you're a part of the UAC family and you're tuned in right now, you're probably someone who's specifically civically engaged. But my argument is that it's so frequent in our city that we get into rooms and it's the same people sitting in the room. And what that requires from me, my perspective, is that I have to get to different rooms. I can't just stay in Center City. I need to get out into the neighborhood that I grew up in and sit in circles with people that I don't sit with all the time. But if you get engaged, your contribution and your perspective will do more to educate and participate and raise people up. And I'm not implying that people do not participate. What I'm saying, though, is that you really have to push yourself to do things differently, showing up for jury duty, doing all of the things that are necessary for those small incremental changes, which will empower other people like myself and the people that are on this board.
Thank you, Kevin.
I'll add 2 things. Know your history. I went to a good school system, but it's only been in my adult life that I realized how sanitized my history lessons were. Once you understand the threads of systemic injustice throughout history in this country, you're never the same. But that leads to a second thing, which is that you have to do something about that. And what you have to do is you have to acknowledge that that is a problem, and that if you're not actively contributing to the solution, then you're part of the problem. Reverend Kelly, I was remiss to go spiritual in our last conversation, since you're the preacher, but we were talking about the notions of sin and repentance, and these are in our faith tradition, in my faith tradition, both personal and group things. You can repent for personal sin, and most of us need to on the issue of racism. And you can also repent on behalf of a group for group sin. And so creating space and having the humility to go in that direction, I think is important. Knowing your history, knowing how unjust that history has been, and doing something about it in your heart and then taking action is absolutely what we all need to do.
Well, I want to thank you all for this question and answer section of the program. And I think we're handing it off to our good friend, Steve Fera. Thank you again, one and all.
Hi, I'm Steve Fera, Executive Vice President of Public Affairs at Independence Blue Cross and proud co-chair of the Ending Racism Partnerships Steering Committee. Thank you for joining us today in our first Ending Racism Partnership event series, A Blueprint to End Racism. As we kick off the partnership today, we're encouraged by the level of engagement from our partners and community members, and we're excited by the momentum that we've achieved thus far. But we're even more excited that we're just getting started. As my friend Sharmain says, this is a movement, not a moment. And the Ending Racism Partnership has big goals, a long way to go, and we're moving forward together. So here's how you can join the movement. Today, we're launching a citywide survey designed to engage all Philadelphians to inform our partnership of the lived experiences and perceptions of racism across the city. This survey takes less than 5 minutes to complete. You can use your phone or computer to complete it. It's available in English today, and it will be available in Spanish and Chinese in the coming days. You can access and complete the survey by visiting endingracismpartnership.org. You can also visit the website to stay up to date about the work of the partnership, sign up to get involved in our community and stakeholder roundtables, and sign up to access a toolkit to host your own Ending Racism conversation with your network of friends and family. Lastly, we hope that you are inspired by the roundtable event today, and we hope that you'll join us for our next Blueprint to End Racism event in the spring, as we dive deeper into the pillars of our work, starting with a conversation about health and health equity. Thank you to today's speakers and panelists, and a special thank you to my fellow co-chairs, Sharmain Matlock-Turner and Reverend Dr. Mark Tyler, and all the leaders who make up our Ending Racism Partnership Steering Committee. On behalf of Independence Blue Cross, the Urban Affairs Coalition, Mother Bethel AME Church, and all of the individuals, organizations, and companies who make up the Ending Racism Partnership, thank you for joining us.